Cuban Missile Crisis addressed to the nation by John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was born in Brookline, Massachusetts on May 29, 1917. He grew up in a wealthy family and attended Harvard University. In 1937, he was appointed the United States Ambassador to England. After graduating from Harvard, JFK joined the Army and was made a lieutenant during World War II. He was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives in 1946 for 3 terms and then went on to the Senate in 1952. He married Jacqueline Bouvier, who became known as Jackie O during his presidency at the age of 36. In 1960, he defeated the Republican Vice President Richard Nixon and was elected as the 35th President of the United States. During his presidency, JFK created the Peace Corps and proposed the Civil Rights Act that would be passed by President Johnson. At the age of 43, he was the youngest man elected president and the first Catholic to hold office. Tragically, President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963. During the Cold War in 1962, an American spy plane secretly photographed nuclear missile sites being built by the Soviet Union on the communist-led island of Cuba. President Kennedy did not invade Cuba because that could have started a world war. But he could not let the missile sites be completed, so he decided on a naval blockade to prevent Russian ships delivering the missiles to Cuba. Soviet leader Khrushchev warned that Russia would see the blockade as an act of war. Russian forces were put on alert, and U.S. bombers were put in the air carrying nuclear bombs in preparation to invade Cuba. For 13 days in October 1962, there was massive tension as everyone waited with the thought that the world was going to end. On October 22nd, on the TV and the radio, JFK spoke to the Americans about the circumstances with Russia and the decisions to enact a naval blockade. To resolve the crisis, Khrushchev offered to dismantle the Cuban bases if Kennedy lifted the blockade and promised not to invade Cuba. Kennedy publicly agreed and announced the crisis was over, but also secretly agreed to removing U.S. nuclear bases from Turkey. The speaker was the beloved 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, and the occasion of his speech was an address to the nation given on October 22, 1962, broadcast on TV and radio from the Oval Office. Kennedy's direct audience was the American public, but his speech was heard worldwide, which can be seen when he addresses the captive people of Cuba and the entire Western Hemisphere. His purpose was to inform the public of the crisis on national security when he said, "This government feels obligated to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail." He also informed of his decision to impose a naval blockade around Cuba when he stated, "To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated." The subject of Kennedy's speech was the crisis involving the missiles on site 90 miles away from the coast of South Florida and the uncertainties of a Third World War. When he states, "Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of the bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere." Kennedy's tone throughout the address was informative of the context of the crisis, worrisome about the future, and serious about potential dangers when he stated, "Our policy has been one of patience and restraint." Diction. Throughout his speech, Kennedy vocalized themes of peace and freedom when he said, "Our goal is not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom." He also spoke of fear with regard to the missiles. Kennedy utilized figurative language when he said, "On the bullseye of Soviet missiles," and "The path we have chosen is full of hazards," and "the fruits of victory," to create an image in the minds of those listening. Kennedy informs his audience with realistic details when he describes the Cuban arms as medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. President Kennedy faces uncertainties when he says, "It is difficult to settle or even discuss these problems," and when he says, "I had directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventualities." He also provides evidence of dealing with the Soviet relations. Ethos. As President of the United States, Kennedy automatically establishes his credibility, but in his speech, he furthers his ethical appeal to the audience by stating, "I speak to you as a friend, as one who knows of your deep attachment to your fatherland, and as one who shares your aspirations for liberty and justice for all." Pathos. Kennedy appeals to the concerns and troubles of the Cuban listeners by watching with deep sorrow and speaking out against the communist leaders who have turned their friends and neighbors in the Americas against them. Logos. Kennedy makes numerous references to specific details about the crisis itself, such as the missile's capability of striking in Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States. He also speaks of historical events that influenced the communist takeover of Cuba, such as the Rio Pact of 1947 and the Joint Resolution of 87th Congress. Historical strategies. Kennedy uses repetition throughout his speech. In this example, he states, we have, over and over to inform the audience of the circumstances of the crisis. He also uses metaphor when he says, we will not risk the costs of worldwide nuclear war in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth, but neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced. Kennedy also incorporates parallel structure into his speech when he describes the nuclear weapons as so destructive and so swift. And he also uses alliteration to provide emphasis and grasp attention. The Cuban Missile Crisis during the Cold War was one of the most dramatic events in all of history, and John F. Kennedy's address to the people will continue to echo throughout time.